And I'm going to be talking to you about literacy tasks that students do and that you're not doing, because when we really want to get to student learning, we need our students to be doing the doing, not us to be doing the doing. So as I just showed you, this is my new book, The Big Book of Literacy Tasks. So I just wanted to show it one more time. Some of the books that I'm going to be talking about tonight come from a book collection that I have with AKJ Education, called the Noteworthy Nonfiction Collection, and I'll be sharing a couple of the resources from this Noteworthy Nonfiction Collection as well. So as an overview, you need to be thinking about what your students are doing in your classroom that develops their ability to read and write and think for themselves. Too much of the time, we spend time doing the reading, writing, and thinking, and they're mimicking us or copying us, or we're modeling, maybe too much modeling, and sometimes I call this helicopter teaching. We need to avoid helicopter teaching, and we really need to focus instead on modeling and scaffolding and supporting. Too often, our help can become toxic. So in other words, we overteach, we over-support, we over-scaffold, and we never give time for students to do things on their own. I'm going to give a perfect example of this that I can remember from my childhood. I would work with my dad on home projects, and one time we were painting the deck, and it didn't matter how well I painted the deck, my dad would come paint it over after me. And it was really defeating as a student. I have felt that sometimes even in classes in college with professors when it's like I couldn't write it my way. I had to write it exactly the way they wanted it to sound. Our students don't learn from us if we're constantly doing the doing for them and we're not releasing to them. The key is to think about our instructional core. So check out this block right here, and the red part inside is the core. The core needs to be where everything is perfectly balanced. Our role, the student's role, and the curriculum. So you can see that the three triangle idea of the core right here on this slide. You can see the teacher, the content, which the content's actually our standards. It's not programs that we use, it's our standards. And then the students. When we want to increase student learning, we need to change their role in our classroom and how they interact with the content. We need to change our role to one of facilitator, where we model, we encourage, and we support. But we've got to untie ourselves from those dot cams, and we've got to untie ourselves from PowerPoint slides, or if we're working with very young children and they're on the carpet with us, we've got to start asking them to do the thinking about the books and not to be doing the thinking for them. So 3 things to remember about the instructional core. Increases in student learning occur based on the type of student engagement. So if you want your students doing more thinking, they need to think for themselves. This is the time of year that I work with a lot of teachers, and they're coming in and saying, oh my goodness, my students can't do what my kids could do last May. Well, no, they can't. It's a new year, but they're going to be able to do those things faster if you scaffold up for them and help them. And tonight I'm going to be giving you 5 ways that you can do that. The other thing to remember about the instructional core is the academic task, and that's what we see students doing in the classroom at any time of the day. So if I were to walk in and visit your classroom, what would I see your students doing? Would they be reading on their own? Would they be writing? Or would they be doing worksheets around reading or activities around reading? We want it to become as authentic as possible where they're doing the real reading and the real writing. The other thing we have to remember is task predicts performance. That particular phrase comes from Richard Elmore, who's a researcher that's worked with Elizabeth City. And he says that whatever students are doing every single day in our classrooms is what they're going to be able to do at the end of the year when they have to take those big, heavy, difficult, standardized tests that we give them. So we just have to remember that what they do every single day is what they're going to be able to do at the end. The tasks that they receive every day will create the performance. But what I'm really concerned about is creating super strong learners that know how to analyze text, that know how to think on their own, that know how to write about text, and don't depend on me writing it first and then copying what I've written. So the key thing is we want active tasks, not passive tasks. Remember, tasks are the things that students are doing in your classroom at any given time. I realize that task may not be the best word for this, but I kind of have reorganized the way I think about tasks. Tasks should inspire creativity and passion. They should spark learning, and they should get students ready to learn. They should really create the glue that connects your students to you. That's what good tasks do. Active tasks are tasks where the students are doing the work and they're not sitting around bored, waiting for us to finish doing the work or waiting for us to finish doing the thinking. Let me give you an example of this. I'll give you a primary example. So you have the picture of first grade right in front of you right now. Those children are pretty involved in an active, busy task where they were writing about something that they had read. They have their book boxes there and they have their journals open. That is the opposite of them sitting on the carpet with nothing in their hands, watching the teacher write about something that the class has read. Now that's what we want to do with modeling, but we can't do that forever. There's a point after modeling we have to release, and the students have to do the writing, their own writing, not something that we wrote and they're copying. So 3 premises to great tasks. Designing great tasks means students are doing the doing. It means students learn by doing, and effort pays off. It's true that sometimes we're going to put tasks in front of students that are a little bit hard, but effort pays off. If the work wasn't a little bit hard, they wouldn't be engaged with us. The definition of student engagement means that someone is cognitively engaged in the work. That means their brain is thinking. So there has to be a little bit of effort going on. If we're doing all the work and they're just watching us or copying or mimicking us, their brains are not going to be cognitively engaged. So we need to nurture strong, independent learners by fostering independence. And you can do this by focusing on active tasks. So let's think about an instructional task by thinking about what students are actually doing in your classroom. Like tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., what are they actually going to be doing? Remember, the instructional task is the work that students are asked to do in the process of instruction. It's not what you think you asked them to do, like what you planned, or what the official curriculum says that they're to do. It's what they actually did. So there's so many times that I have planned the best lesson, the lesson that I thought was just gonna hit it out of the park. And then I realized halfway through that I never released to the students, that I never actually taught the lesson the way I had planned it. We need to really focus on our objectives and make sure our objectives are focused on students doing active learning and that we're releasing and not hanging on too long. So let's figure out what the students were doing in this task I'm going to show you and what the teacher was doing. So here's one. This is not the most eloquent, but it is student written, and I'm going to read it to you. And I want you to think about what the task was that the teacher probably gave to the students. So this is Luke and Jen. In the passage, you will read about 2 characters in Among the Hidden named Luke and Jen. I'm sorry. Luke and Jen are similar and different in many ways. Instead, I have to get closer. Oh my goodness, this is what happens when you don't have your glasses on. Here we go. Okay, in the end of this passage, I will share my personal opinion of the book and characters. This paragraph will be about the differences of Luke and Jen. First, Jen is brave and Luke is scared. I know this because on page 11, Luke says, "What if the population police stop you before you get to the Capitol?" And Luke also says, "Jen, I can't go." Then Jen replies, "Yes, you can. I know you're scared, but who isn't?" This paragraph will be about similar. First, they're both shadow children. Also, they want to be free. Clearly, you can see the similarities and differences. So when I look at this student writing, I can see that it's not perfect. This student has repeated a few things and is a little bit mixed up between, am I writing about similarities and differences, Or am I writing about my topic and my idea and making sure I got a topic sentence in there? But it doesn't matter. The student did it for themselves. And this is so much more powerful than formulaic writing, where perhaps the student is following a pattern and not giving it a try. So I asked you to think about what the task might have been, and I'm hoping you can tell that the task was about comparing and contrasting the characters. So let's think about what they're doing in this example. So I snapped this photo when I was in a classroom, and the students were writing on their own while the teacher was meeting with small groups for reading instruction. And the paper says this: write the 3 details about the chapter you read. Try to think about beginning, middle, and end. Ask yourself, what are some important details about the chapter? Make sure you have 3 complete sentences. Use capital letters and punctuation appropriately. Now, I know already that this is a student task that's highly active, engaging, because the student was reading and then writing on their own. Remember, I said the teacher was over in reading groups. She wasn't even around. She was going to check what the students had written at a later time in the day. She wasn't going to correct it either for correctness of punctuation and capitalization, even though she had mentioned that she's expecting that. She was going to correct and see if they'd been able to write about 3 details in the chapter, or if she needed to model that again. Here's an example from a 1st grade classroom. So this 1st grade classroom was going to go do their own writing, and their writing was to follow this model. And the model was, I have an opinion. My opinion is because. And at the bottom of the page, you can see that the teacher had written what opinion is. Opinion is our thinking about something that has occurred in. Opinion is our thinking about something that has occurred in the book. We use our knowledge. So the students were going to go write on their own what their opinion was and what made them think about their opinion. Here's an example of that. The teacher had read aloud the book Gaston, and by Michelle DeCuscio. And here's what one of the 1st graders wrote. My opinion is yes. So they were asked a specific question if they thought the dog families were going to exchange dogs. If you know Gaston, you'll know why that makes sense. If not, I encourage you to read the book, because I don't have time to read it to you tonight. But here's what this 1st grader wrote. My opinion is yes, because Gaston was a bulldog and one was a poodle in the other family, so they didn't switch. Opinion, statement why, and the student wrote it all on their own. So when we think about getting the students to do the doing, you need to think about shifting the task. The supportive focus is I do, you do, with me standing beside you and coaching you, we do, but quickly, just until you get it, so that I can move on, and then you do it yourself in independent work. I like to shift it to a thinking of you can do it. And I'd like to keep my I do to just quick modeling. I like to keep my we do fairly short so that they don't feel like they have to copy me. And I like extended long you do's in the classroom where I am there coaching them, guiding them, and supporting them along the way. So we're going to go through a series of activities, and I'm going to be suggesting ways that we can validate what students are doing, suggest one more little thing they can do, and support their learning while they're doing things for themselves. We're going to take a look at these 5 different tasks that come out of the book, the Big Book of Literacy Tasks. I'm going to hold it up again so it comes out of this book. The first one is band boring connections. Then we're going to look at creating a structured outline of text, sit and strip statements, yesterday's news, and posing questions for easier inquiry. So the first one is band boring connections. What students are going to do is make connections to text that aren't the same old connections that they always make to text. The process that they're going to be involved in is reading and thinking of the connection that they can make to the text. What the end product should look like is the student to be able to make a connection that is not one of the connections that they've discussed and banned from the classroom. Oh, I hear teachers tell me all the time about connections they wish they could ban in class. For instance, this book reminds me of my mom, or this book reminds me of my dad, or my brother, or my sister, or what I did last weekend. They'd love to hear connections about family members, but maybe something really specific. Like, this book reminds me about the time that my mom got really mad at me in the shoe store. Something more specific like that. The fourth thing I want you to reflect on as I go through this is, how would you teach it? So this is a page right out of the book. You can see how clear the task is laid out. So this is the instructional activity. I have the part that's called your instructional playbook in the book, and those are the directions that you follow. This is not a book where you need to do a lot of reading. This is a book where you teach from. So you would turn to a task. For example, this is task number 4. You could read the name it. This is what you would say to students. You can read the what you might say next, and you can see that there in pink. And that is exactly what you would say to students. And then the remainder of it goes on to tell you what to do. So in this task, I brainstorm with students connections that we're not going to say anymore. We're going to brainstorm connections that are richer and deeper and things that we can push for. We want to get to their juicy thinking. So here's an example of a teaching chart from someone's classroom who worked on band boring connections, and she was very artistic, and she created this cute little sign. So this is what she had banned in her classroom. This reminds me of my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister. Instead, she said, discuss something or someone you don't usually write about. Another one she banned, yesterday I came to school, or yesterday I went home. And she suggests, instead, discuss what happened to you that isn't routine. Another one she banned was when I was little, or when I was a baby and I got in trouble. And she wrote there, memories can be so engaging as connections. Use specifics. So she was encouraging them to make connections to the text, but be specific. So I'm going to go up here real quick one more time. I'm going to read this poem to you by Maya Angelou, and I want you to think of a connection that you make to the poem, but I'm going to encourage you to make a connection that isn't something you might usually make. Okay, here we go. Wonder. A day, drunk with the nectar of slowness, weaves its way between the years to find itself at the flophouse of night, to sleep and be seen no more. Will I be less dead because I wrote this poem, or you because you read it long years hence? So I could make a connection that I always make, which is, oh, it reminds me of the cycle of life, and somebody wrote this poem, and then maybe I'm going to read it after they're gone, and it's going to remind me of them. But that is just a connection that I could make to anything that has to do with life and how life ends, kind of like the day ends. But maybe I could make a different connection. I could connect to the first few sentences. A day drunk with the nectar of slowness weaves its way between the years. And I've had days like that. I've had days that are slow and luxurious. I had a day like that last Sunday. And how I'd love for days like that to go on and on and on, endless. Sometimes they do, and they end up being years. So what kind of connection could you make? Now, obviously, this is in text for an adult, and I put it here to get your brain cognitively engaged in the poem the way our students are cognitively engaged when we put grade appropriate poems in front of them. But I wanted you to have an example of ways you can get them to think a little bit deeper to get to the juicy thinking. So you can do this task by talking about connections that you're banning. You could suggest connections that are deeper. You can brainstorm with your students connections that could be deeper, and you could create an anchor chart with deeper connections and ideas, just like that teacher did on that one that I showed you. How might you support students with this task? Read to them, read aloud, do choral reading, do independent reading, read and read a lot. You need to facilitate. So you're going to suggestion, you might question with support. So if a student gives you a connection that isn't very deep, you might ask, what else could you think about? Remember to validate, suggest, and support. You validate, I really like that you made a connection. You suggest, I'm thinking that the connection you made might be our band on our band boring connections list. What else could you think of? And then you could support. Talk with a partner about making a deeper connections. Let's come up with something else. So remember, as you push for harder tasks, you're going to validate, suggest, and support. Okay, here's the second task, structured outline of text. So in this task, students are going to outline text that they're reading. They think through the text. They think of the outline that they could come up with. It's not us thinking of the outline they could come up with and then they copy it. It's them thinking of the outline. Now, obviously, you're going to have to model this a few times before they do it on their own, but eventually they should be able to do it for themselves. If they're young children, they can still create the outline, but prod and ask questions like, what should I write next? What would come next in the outline? Don't just assume they don't know and do it. So let's take a look at it. Here you can see the page in the book that is the creating the structured outline of a text, and just like the other example I showed you, there is an instructional playbook. I hope you can see it there on your screen. The first words in pink are name it and what you might say next, and that gives you the directions. That gives you the things I'm telling you right now, tonight. Here's an example of a structured outline of text that one teacher had students make. Now, the interesting thing about this is it looks like a typical narrative plot draft, but it's not. They've used a nonfiction book that had a story to it, and we're using a plot map to actually provide information that was being given in a sequence in a nonfiction book. So I'm going to read to you a little bit, and we're going to think about what we could say. So this this piece that I'm going to read to you is on orchids. So, deep in the jungles of Colombia, there's a kind of flower that attracts bees to their unique perfume. The male bees store as much scent as possible from this particular flower on their hind legs. The male bees that collect the most scent attract the female bees to mate with them. In Venezuela, there's a flower people collect for its large white or yellow petals. Few people ever find it though, since it only blooms for a few days. There's a pink and yellow flower that only grows in a very specific part of the state of Florida. It also only grows on trees, and winds or birds may spread its seeds. These flowers are some of the most rare and delicate species in all of nature. They're all types of orchids. So you could create a structured outline with students with orchids at the top, and then you could have the first line, and I would say to them, what would be the first line we need to put? What's the first line that the text said? And obviously, it's going to be something about the male bees being attracted to the jungle, the orchid in the jungles of Colombia, but I don't come up with it, they come up with it. The next thing, check your text. What would be the next thing we might write about? And hopefully they're going to notice it's Venezuela. We're going to write about Venezuelan orchids. So it's orchids, and then we'd be going down. What's here? What's here? What's here? Now, the one I showed you before was a plot map. Obviously, though, this one I'm talking about on orchids would be more of a linear map and a linear structured outline. The book talks about different ways you can do the structures. So when I set students up for this task, I pull big ideas from the text. I suggest ways that they could organize the big ideas in an organized fashion on their paper. And then I also brainstorm with them the points and how they could organize them, creating a structured outline on a chart. To do it, I'm going to again read. I'm going to read to them. I'm going to get them reading. We're going to do choral reading. We are going to read. But I'm going to facilitate and suggest and question with support. So I might validate. I really like that you pulled some facts from the text. Or I could suggest. I'm thinking that you could organize these facts in a way that would form an outline. And I would show them what an outline is. I just wouldn't do the outline for them. And then I might say something like, what would be the first step to take? You validate, you suggest, and you support to get the students to doing the doing. The one thing that I can tell you that teachers tell me all the time is their students don't want to do this harder thinking. Well, of course not. It's harder. They've learned if they sit around and wait for us, we'll rush into the void and we'll do the work for them. So you do have to give them enough wait time, and you do need to validate them enough that they don't doubt their own thinking. So here's another one. sentence strip statements. So in this particular task, students will get a sentence strip and take one sentence out of this of the whole paragraph or piece that they think is important. They're going to work in a small group so that if each one of them takes out a sentence that they think is important, they can then check it and they can create a statement, which ends up being like a small summary. So that's what they're going to do. They're creating a statement or a short summary about what they read. They're each going to get a sentence strip. They're each going to write one sentence down on the sentence strip that they think was important from the text. And in the end, they'll be able to take their sentence strips and move them around and create a cohesive paragraph. So as in the other examples, sentence strip statements is right in the book. You can see your instructional playbook there, the name it, what you might say next, and the next page that you can't see says model and then release. So how do you model it and then how do you release? I want to show you one that was done with kindergartners. This was a sentence strip statement done with kindergartners, and the kindergartners had been reading different books about insects and animals that laid eggs. The teacher did not use a traditional sentence strip with them because of their age. They needed a little more room. So she used an 8.5 by 11 piece of copy paper and just made the lines on there. And then the children wrote, hens and alligators and black widows and seahorses lay eggs. That was one thing that one child thought was important. But if you went into the classroom, you'll see that each child had written something different on their sentence strip, and then they were able to put them together. Here's one from a 5th grade classroom. In Mongolia, the holidays are Children's Day and Sagayan Star. People in Mongolia speak Kalaka Mongol, and in Mongolia, life is different than in the United States. So these are 3 different sentences written on different sentence strips that the students were able to put together to write a short summary or really just a statement about the text. Here's another example of one that was done a little bit differently in a 1st grade classroom. The teacher just said what was the main idea of the card, and the children, you can kind of see the faint handwriting there. It didn't come through very well in the picture, but they had worked in a group and they had picked 2 sentences and wrote them down, and then they were illustrating it. It's the same idea as a sentence strip. It's just on a big piece of construction paper. So here is a book I want us to think about. Poet of Science by Ada Lovelace. I want you to think about one thing that you could pick out of this book and write on a sentence strip. I'll tell you what mine is when we get to the end. Long, long ago, on a cold winter day, a lonely little girl walked from room to room in a big, old, dark country house. Her name was Ada Byron, and she was looking for something to do. Ada was good at imagining things. She imagined it would be fun to fly. Then she went about it in a scientific way. First, she studied the flight and the anatomy of birds. She decided her wings would be like theirs, only larger in proportion to her size. She would build the frames out of sturdy wire so her wings would be strong, and then cover the frames with oil-rubbed silk so they would also be light. Finally, she designed a harness to attach the wings to her back. She thought it would be fun to fly from house to house delivering the mail. Okay. She'd need to bring a bag for carrying the letters, a map, and a compass for navigation. So I want you to think, what would be the one sentence you would pick? I would pick the sentence that said she was really bored and she started thinking about birds. So I would write that on my sentence strip, but you might write something else. And the director of CRLP is online with us, and her name is Dr. Nicole Walsh. Nicole might have picked another thing, and then we could write our sentences on our sentence strips. We could stand at a desk, put our sentence strips together. We could organize them in a fashion that made sense, and then we would have a short statement or summary about what we read. So how do we set them up? Talk about what you think while you're reading to make sure you're comprehending. Students are going to have to think for themselves, what is this saying? And then they're going to have to they're going to have to take little notes, little jots. You're going to have to model those so that they know what they can say or something that intrigued them. Then they're going to take their say something statement and write it on a sentence strip. You will need to model how that is done first. So again, how do we support them? And I bet you can guess my number one thing is read. We can support them by them reading, us reading to them, choral reading and independent reading. We can facilitate. We're going to validate. I think that you're thinking very deeply about what you read. Suggest. I wonder what you could say about what you read. What's one big thing you could say? Or, as I mentioned a minute ago, just take the sentence right out of the book and write that down on your sentence strip. So we're going to explore another task. This one's called Yesterday's News. In Yesterday's News, you can do it two ways. You can either use it when reading a chapter book and students write the news from yesterday or yesterday's chapter or the chapter you might have worked on last week as a little news flash. Or for young children, I often do Yesterday's News as a way of doing a guided writing. And I have them think about what happened yesterday in our classroom and we do a guided writing together. The process that they engage in is writing some statements about something that has happened previously. And there's different ways that the end product could look like. It could be a chart. It could be something in their reading journal that they wrote down. You're going to see it here as a little brochure. So again, just like in the other tasks, in my book, I give clear and explicit information on how to do it. On this particular one, you can actually see the directions for the model due together right there. And I give an example in the bottom quarter, and I do that on all the pages in the book. So when I'm explaining directions, there's a picture so you know what to do and you don't have to read a lot to figure it out. So this one down here in the bottom, part of it says this. Alert, boy lost dog and it's not a very good day for him. Peter made posters because he hopes he can find his dog. Peter began the search. So this is the little news flash. This is yesterday's news. This is what happened in the book. Alert, a boy lost his dog. He made posters. He began the search. The students can also add graphics or a picture if needed. But the idea is for them to create little snapshots about what's been read before, or like I said, in primary classrooms, maybe what happened in the classroom the day before. That is what the whole brochure looked like that this one student had done about the book. So how I use this is I remind students that they know a lot about what was read on a previous day, and I try to dig up those memories. Then I model doing a short news report. And if I have students that are struggling with this, I might suggest they just do it orally, but they could also write it down. But I do have to tell you one thing, if I've modeled it, when I have them do it, I hide my modeling or else they just copy me. So again, have them read or you read. You're going to facilitate by validating. I noticed that you took some time to think about what you discussed with your partner with what was read yesterday. You're going to suggest. I wonder what you could say about what was read. And you're going to support. What do you want to write down? And here's the last one we're going to do tonight. Posing questions for easier inquiry. In this task, you want students to think of their own questions so that they can dig in and examine and investigate something. So the end product is them actually just writing their questions for their investigation. It's not the whole investigation, it's just the questions. You can easily do this with primary students by having the class brainstorm the questions and then you could write them down. For older students, I would have them do their own brainstorming and having them write down their own questions. So this is what it looks like from the book. Again, you can see the name it and what you might do together. You can also see the example there of what some of the questions looked like. This is the example up close. So here's a student who was in 6th grade and she was examining rocks. She was doing a report on rocks. So she started with those guiding questions that are on the bottom. Do you see those down there on the left-hand side? Her guiding question was, what is the rock cycle? They had read something about the rock cycle in their science text, but she wanted to know more about that. She did some brainstorming, and honestly, I have to tell you, she did a map where she had put rocks in the middle, and she had drawn all her thinking about rocks all the way around, and one of the things that she had written was rock cycle, and she circled that and said, I wonder what the rock cycle is. And then that became her inquiry question that led her to do her research. So what you're seeing here is just some of the things that she had written on her note cards as she was doing her research based on the rock cycle. Here's a quick one that I put up because I thought it might be nice to think about how do teachers, let off steam at the end of the day. And if I did a graphic on that, I'd say that they relax. So my inquiry might have been, how do teachers let off steam at the end of the day? They relax. So you can see in this example, there's a lot of writing. And in this example, there's just a lot of pictures. Students can ask an inquiry question and then they can investigate it either through writing or through pictures. To do this, you're going to set up the inquiry by suggesting to students they come up with questions to guide their thinking. You can stimulate that thinking. What if? In what way? Or how? Help them think of an inquiry that they'd like to pursue, but keep it small so it's not too big that they can actually do the work. When I'm working with this, I facilitate by validating. I like the way you're thinking about questions you have on this topic. You could make a suggestion. I'm wondering what you already know and how you could use that as a starting place, and you could support. Keep your notes on a card or, for really little ones, on a sentence strip. I will often do the inquiries in a kindergarten through second grade classroom, whole class, bring them down to the carpet. Maybe we've read a series of books around a particular topic, like flooding, because there's flooding going on in the news right now. And I might ask them, so what do you wonder about flooding? What do you want to know about it? And then from whatever comes up, we might investigate that. Some of them might want to know, how do people stay safe? How do they take care of each other? What happens to their pets? And then maybe we could look up some information and we could do our research and write it on the sentence strips. Remember, whenever you're working on a task, you want to validate, suggest, and support. You also want to focus on your criteria for success, which means once they get it, what's it got to look like for you? And I just wanted to show you a couple of anchor charts to finish this out tonight. So this teacher was working on picture book studies, and she had written some things that she wanted them to be able to talk about. She'd done it with with questions, but she wanted the students to be able to reflect in their notebook about the use of time in a picture book, or the lead, or the repetition. And she put there, like under craft, how does the author make their writing stand out? So the student knew the criteria of success was that they had to write about how the author made their writing stand out. Here's another example of that. So she was doing a book talk, working on nonfiction, and wanting students to ask some big questions so they could know how to find out a lot of information. And the class worked together on little questions with not a lot of information, and big questions where they could find some big thinking and big ideas and really investigate. So this was her criteria for success of what their questions needed to look like. So as an ending tonight, I want to remind you to shift that task. Focus on the I do where you model, you do where you're coaching, we do quickly, don't take too much time. You don't want it to be involved in a we do where you're doing everything and they're just copying you. You want it to be focused on a you do, or where the students are doing the doing and you're just supporting. Thank you for joining me tonight. I appreciate your time, and I wish you the best of luck on your tasks and activities in your classroom. Get the students to do the doing.